All right, so we have been focused on the Cold War and really how it's between the United States and the Soviet Union. Again, there's no actual physical war that breaks out between the two of them, but it is called a Cold War because it's really the psychological warfare of the Soviets and the United States trying to prove that they're better than the other one. So, what effect does that have at Americans at home? And that's really what we're going to get into this week when we look at the Second Red Scare or the McCarthy era. Now, the first Red Scare was shortly after World War One. I don't think we really talked about it in class. I think it was something that I sort of cut. But after World War One, the United States goes into what we call isolationism, meaning that they decide they want to butt out of the world's problems and they just want to focus on themselves. Because of that, they had a real fear of immigrants and anyone that basically was an American. So Italians, Jews, Germans were really targeted against, especially after World War One. Well, that was the first Red Scare. Now we're focusing on the second Red Scare, which takes place in the 1950s. And because we are at war, in a Cold War with the Soviet Union, there was this very real, genuine fear of communism spreading throughout the United States. So normally we do a different activity to kind of get into this, but because we're not in class, obviously we can't do it. But I also have this bell ringer question as well as have you ever had a lie spread about you that was not true, or have you ever told a lie about someone that was not true? What was the result of that lie? And every year that I ask this question, kids get quiet, they don't want to participate. They're like, oh, we don't want to rehash the drama and blah, blah, blah. Here's the deal. We have all told a lie about somebody, even if it wasn't intentional. If you hear gossip and you tell other people about it, like, oh, did you hear about so and so, or did you hear this, or did you hear that? You are spreading a lie, right? You are participating in gossip and rumor spreading. Can it be dangerous? Absolutely. Can it be innocent? Yeah, it certainly can. It's kind of like when you look up tabloid magazines and you'll see like a picture of like Justin Timberlake with his finger to his nose, and they're like, oh, Justin Timberlake eats his burgers. Like, I don't think he really cares about that. But then you have more serious rumors and lies that end up being spread. I think a really great example is Kobe Bryant's death, just a few months ago. Initially, reports are coming out that Rick Fox was also on the plane and that he died. And so then you had people who were calling Rick Fox's family, and then they had to be like, no, he wasn't on the plane. But that can become very dangerous. And that's happened to a few celebrities where there's reports that they died, and then they're like, I've had to call my mom and tell her I didn't die, and this is just a rumor, and this is just a lie. But those things spread and they can become very dangerous. So, why is this kind of important when we're looking at the context of the Second Red Scare? Well, essentially, you're going to have all these people sort of freaked out about communism spreading, and as a result, they're going to be accusing one another of being communists. At this point, all of you should have read The Crucible in your English classes, and in The Crucible, it's really set with the Salem witch trials. If you have everyone accusing one another of being a witch, and people get hanged as a result, and even though we know that it's not true, the people at the time definitely believed it to be true. Well, Arthur Miller, who wrote The Crucible, wrote it during the 1950s, and even though The Crucible is about the Salem witch trials, it was really meant to reflect this era of McCarthyism. Because what's going to happen in the 1950s is that everyone's going to be accusing one another of being a communist, or there were fears of people being communists, and so as a result, they wanted people to rat one another out. You can also sort of compare it to what we see going on in New York City right now. The mayor Bill de Blasio, I think just a couple of days ago, or maybe it was last week, had, released a video with a phone number encouraging people, if you don't see somebody wearing a mask or you don't see somebody social distancing, we want you to text this number and rat those people out. And some people were like, hey, that's really intense. I can't believe you want us to rat somebody out for not wearing a mask. But that's very similar to what was going on in the 1950s in McCarthyism is if you thought somebody was a communist or you had suspicions of them being a communist, the government wanted you to rat them out so that way we can oust them and really sort of prove that they were un-American. So as the Cold War is going, Americans are trying to figure out how do we combat communist influence at home. And that's really what they're going to start doing is being very fearful of anybody who was essentially thought to be a communist. And the Red Scare is really going to intensify when Senator Joseph McCarthy presided over a Senate committee charged with exposing communists in the government. And we'll talk about McCarthy a little bit later, but he's really going to be the guy that spearheads these trials and these public accusations of accusing people of being communists. So the Red Scare, it's really going to begin during the 1950s, and it's just rumors and accusations of communists in the Soviet or in the United States, and this led to fears that communists were attempting to take over the world. Because again, you have to think at this time the United States has this containment policy, this idea that we want to contain communism and not let it spread. So if all of a sudden you have people in the United States who are communists, that means we're not containing communism at all. In fact, it is spreading, and there was this really big fear that communism was going to spread in the United States, and as a result, take over our democracy, take over our election process, and people did not want that to happen. So, what exactly was the fear? That communist subversion, again, an effort to secretly weaken a society and overthrow its government, meaning that we would become a communist government and not a democratic one, which is what we have today. Really, technically, we're a republic, but you guys hopefully get the idea. So, how exactly did this all start? Igor, I can't even pronounce his last name, he was a clerk who was working for the Soviet embassy in Canada. And the Soviets had decided that they were going to go ahead and call Igor back to come back to the Soviet Union. And Igor, basically, he didn't want to go. He was happy with his life in Canada. You know, the Soviet Union's really cold. He wasn't necessarily like a huge fan of communism. And so he decided he's going to go ahead and deflect. And so he decides that he's going to go ahead and let the United States and the Canadian government know that, hey, you've got spies for the Soviet Union within your own governments who are basically trying to figure out a way to manipulate the system. So Igor, initially, when he decides to deflect, he goes to the Canadian Police Department. And he basically is like, tells them the whole thing, how he's deflecting. And they're like, yeah, thanks. We'll see you later. And Igor's kind of surprised. He just went to the police department, told him he was a Soviet spy, and they didn't take him seriously. So then he tries a major newspaper, and again, he tells them the exact same thing. He's a Soviet spy, he's going to deflect, he's going to give the Canadians and the US information on what the Soviet Union's trying to do. And the newspaper's like, yeah, thanks, see you later. They don't believe him either. At this point, Igor is completely freaked out. He's paranoid. He knows that if the Soviets find out he's deflected, they're going to kill him. So rather than staying in his apartment that night, he decides to stay in the apartment across the hall. And rather than going to sleep, he watches through the peephole the entire time because, again, he's really fearful that the Soviets are going to figure out that he tried to deflect. Well, sure enough, in the middle of the night, two guys show up to his apartment, they break in, and they completely ransack the place looking for Igor. What they didn't know was that Igor was across the hall. So at this point, Igor is completely freaked out. He knows that the Soviets know he's deflected, and again, if they get a hold of him, they're going to kill him. So eventually, Igor goes back to the newspaper, explains the story once again, and at that point, the newspaper believes him. The police department, they end up taking him in as well, and then it becomes clear at this point that the Soviet Union does indeed have spies in both the Canadian and U.S. governments, and they're trying to really sort of infiltrate the U.S. So as a result, as a way to try to combat the fact that you have spies like Igor who are in the United States who are giving information to the Soviet Union, the United States is going to create what's called the HUAC. So it's the House of Un-American Activities. And this was created in 1938, and initially it was to investigate both fascist and communist activities. In 1938, that's a year before World War II is going to begin. And even though the United States wasn't officially involved in World War II until 1941, we know that the U.S. definitely has a stake in what's going to happen, right? They're supporting the Allies, particularly the British. They certainly don't want to see Hitler from Germany and Mussolini from Italy come to power, and they're watching what's going on in Europe very closely. And as a result, they want to make sure that communism and fascism wasn't spreading in the United States. So initially, the HUAC was created to investigate anyone who would sympathize with Hitler's Germany or Mussolini's Italy. J. Edgar Hoover, who was in charge of, or eventually becomes in charge of the FBI, he's going to urge the committee to hold public hearings on communist subversion. And the idea was to be, if you were to publicly embarrass people for being either a communist or communist sympathizers, then chances are you were going to get them to sort of retract and not want to be communists anymore. You can kind of see that, I would say, with sort of the Colin Kaepernick. You know, when he took the knee, there was a lot of debate over whether or not it was patriotic or un-American. And maybe some people who didn't agree with Kaepernick taking the knee were like, he definitely has the right to do so because of his First Amendment rights to freedom of speech. And even if people supported Kaepernick, but maybe didn't support him kneeling, they were accused of being un-American or unpatriotic or, sort of anti-American. That's very much what's going to happen with these committee hearings, is that even if you weren't a communist, but you supported people having the right to believe in communism, because again, that is your First Amendment right, then you yourself were also committed or considered un-American and dangerous to American society. And so what's going to happen with the HUAC is that it's going to lead to wiretapping of thousands of phones, and basically people are trying to figure out who is a communist and who isn't. And this will lead us to the Hollywood blacklist. By 1947, the HUAC is going to investigate the motion picture industry. And even today, we know Hollywood to be pretty liberal. Most Hollywood actors, actresses, directors, producers, whoever they are, tend to be more liberal and more Democrat. Very few come out publicly to say that they're a Republican or that they are conservative. But the Hollywood 10, which were a group of writers, refused to rat anybody out whether they were or were not communists. And they claim that it was their First Amendment rights. Like, people have the right, to believe in whatever it is that they want to believe in. Whether or not people are communists or not, their constitutional rights gives them the right to do so. We can kind of compare that to what we see sort of with the rallies going on right now with the COVID-19 pandemic. You have people who are out there holding signs saying that this is violating my constitutional rights, that these stay-at-home orders can't be implemented, blah, blah, blah. Whether or not you agree or disagree with it, they're arguing First Amendment rights. The Hollywood 10 are basically going to do the exact same thing. They're like, it doesn't matter if someone's communist or not. They have the First Amendment right to believe in whatever it is that they want to believe in. And so they refuse to name names or name people who they suspected to be communists. And as a result, they're going to be found guilty of contempt of Congress, and they were sentenced to between 6 and 12 months in prison. And the Hollywood 10 are eventually going to be blacklisted, and it's going to have very damaging effects on their careers. Again, you could sort of compare it to Colin Kaepernick in the NFL. Once he took the knee, he never played in the NFL again. He had those tryouts a couple months ago. But most people would agree. Colin Kaepernick is not coming back to the NFL because he burned so many bridges with him taking the knee. The same thing's going to happen with the Hollywood 10. Again, whether or not you agree with them speaking out or not speaking out, they're going to get blacklisted. And many people are not going to hire them because of the stain that exists on their careers. And so as a result, it's really going to be damaging for them. And in early 1947, Truman's going to establish a loyalty review program to screen all federal employees for their loyalty to the United States. So essentially, most people had to kind of take a loyalty oath, basically Pledge of Allegiance, similar to what we do second period every day. You stand up, you put your hand over your heart, and you say the Pledge of Allegiance. That's kind of a way to sort of show that you are an American citizen, and you support American ideals. This loyalty program was going to be kind of the very same thing that Truman was trying to do, to sort of calm people's fears of there were no communists in the government. And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, J. Edgar Hoover is really going to encourage public hearings on communist subversion, because the idea was if you publicly embarrass people, you can get people who are either communist supporters or sympathizers ratted out and hopefully kind of out of American society. So one of the big people that are going to be accused of being a communist is going to be a guy by the name of Alger Hiss. Whittaker Chambers, who was an editor for Time magazine, and he was a former communist, eventually he's going to deflect from the Communist Party in the United States during the late 1930s. When he does, he tells the FBI and the American government that, hey, you've got communist sympathizers, or at least people who are working with the Soviet Union, working in the United States government. And one of the people that he names is Alger Hiss, who was a really prominent guy at this time. He was a diplomat, meaning that he would represent the United States on an official basis. So like when I traveled to, say, Europe or Mexico or wherever, I'm an American citizen and I'm a tourist. I'm not a diplomat. A diplomat is someone who represents the U.S. on an official basis, so they might meet with other government officials from different countries. Alger Hiss had also helped to start the United Nations shortly after World War II, which still exists today, and so there were a lot of people who were surprised that Alger Hiss was being accused because he was such a prominent role in the government. And Chambers had said that Hiss had gave him secret documents from the State Department, kind of proving that Hiss was indeed a communist. Hiss denied ever knowing Chambers, says, I don't know who this guy is, and eventually the HUAC was going to drop the case against Alger Hiss altogether because they really didn't have a lot of evidence to prove that he may or may not be a communist. In order for something to reach trial or to go to trial, you have to have evidence that a crime was actually committed. And even though Chambers was saying, hey, Hiss is a communist, it was really a he said, she said situation. And so because of that, the HUAC was like, we can't take this to trial. However, Richard Nixon, who at this time was a congressman out of California, he had yet to be vice president or even president, he's going to encourage the committee to continue on Hiss. He sort of felt that something was up. And eventually, they're going to get a little bit out of Hiss. Hiss is going to admit that he knew Chambers, but he knew him under a different name because Chambers was a little bit of a spy, but Hiss was like, I was never a spy. And then Hiss is going to sue Chambers for slander, basically saying he was intentionally spreading lies about him being a communist when it wasn't true. And it's going to go to trial. And when Chambers takes the stand, he actually produces documents in microfilm of really important State Department documents, kind of showing espionage. And he had hidden them in a pumpkin on his farm, and as a result, they become known as the Pumpkin Papers. And after this, Hiss is going to be charged and convicted of perjury, meaning lying under oath, and he's going to spend a little less than 5 years in prison. Even after this, Hiss maintained his innocence, and Chambers maintained that Hiss was a communist spy, but whether or not it's actually true or actually happened, it's really sort of up to you to look at the evidence and decide.